In my last video, I broke the 125. In this one, I'll be rebuilding it, riding some more, and breaking down my technique along the way. After I got the bike home, I pulled the head off immediately to check the piston and found that the ring had seized. I actually already had a new piston ready to go, so I threw it in, put everything back together, and started it up. But it was rattling something awful, so I had to shut it down. I pulled the head off again and checked the connecting rod, and it had a lot of up and down play in it. That was a real bummer because it meant splitting the cases, something I'd never done before. Make sure to check this kind of thing before you put everything back together and potentially cause more damage, by the way. Don't be like me. So I pulled the motor, split the cases, and pulled the crankshaft. It was rusted really bad in a pattern that made it clear just how detrimental leaving the bike exposed to the elements for years had been, which I'm sure led to the bearing failure. While I had it apart, I found that one of the power valve pins had backed itself out. I was able to fix that as well. Then I put a new crankshaft in and put all the pieces I found back together and threw away the leftover parts as one does for weight reduction. All of the work I did at this point was definitely long overdue. I won't spend too much time talking about the rebuild, but I will say that it was very easy. If you want to see more mechanical breakdowns and detailed footage of such, just let me know in the comments. For this rebuild, I didn't have a lot of time to film and really wanted to get it running again, but I can certainly do that if you guys would like to see more of that kind of thing. Alright, now that I'm done wrenching, let's get back to the track. I was super excited to ride again and really wanted to hit the GP track after the rebuild, but the night before I arrived, it had rained. A lot. Now, I didn't want to just call it a day and go home since I had already paid the gate fee, so I decided to stay and tough it out. The benefit of this predicament was that it wasn't crowded. There weren't many people willing to deal with it, and I was just dumb enough to ignore that warning sign. I made a slogging sight lap and it was more difficult than I had anticipated. Riding in the mud was a wake-up call. I really had to push the bike hard. The key was staying on the throttle. If I backed off, the bike immediately slowed to a stop. I had to keep it wrapped out to avoid getting stuck in the muck. If you pay attention, you can tell that my preferred riding style is to build and carry momentum, with a large focus on reducing the instances in which I have to slow down and then regain that momentum after it's lost. This is for two main reasons. One, my little 125 doesn't have a ton of power, so once I get it up to speed, I really have to keep it there because of how hard I have to flog it to regain that speed once it's lost. Two, I want to lighten the bike as much as possible and avoid binding the suspension in places like corners, which of course can have the tendency to stand the bike up or cause the front end to wash out. All this to say that I really try to avoid a stop and go style of riding that I see a lot of people doing at the track. I see it mostly from 450 riders who use their huge power advantage as a cheat code to avoid having to carry speed through the corners. Instead, they just put their foot down, nearly stop the bike, point it where they want to go, and then whack the throttle like it owes them money. Now, it works for them, and if they like it, that's fine. But it looks ham-fisted and does nothing to establish any kind of flow around the track. It's so common, in fact, that these riders tend to cut very prominent lines into most tracks that frankly aren't worth following. I see beginners fall for it a lot, thinking it's the fast line. It's not. And if an idiot like me can see that, then you know it's just blatantly obvious to really high-level riders. I digress, but this will be a recurring theme in my progression, by the way. Well, this muddy day is when I learned that in solid mud, you gotta get on the throttle all the time. The low RPM approach wasn't gonna work. It was frustrating to say the least. The one thing, well, not the one thing, there were a lot of things that I realized very quickly was that I wasn't going to have to use my brakes very much today. The second thing was that I was gonna really have to manhandle this bike. When I did that, it actually simplified a lot of things. I was able to really focus on footwork, maintaining speed, and committing, and I didn't have to worry about braking. This freed up processor speed and was going to allow me to focus on a specific goal. And in my smooth-brainedness, I picked a stupid one. My first goal was simply to be able to corner without tipping over and sliding out. I did make a little departure from the GP track, thinking that a sand track might have better conditions, and that's where this happened.
When it finally grabs, it goes. Nice. This mud is real soft. Yuck. See my elbow? Well, of any days to crash, I'd tell you what, that's the one. Let's get out of here. Wow.
I learned my lesson and headed back to the GP. Honestly, I spent a little more time working on corners, but that proved to be rather difficult to stick to. What kept happening was that ruts had formed and they were deep. And not only were they deep, but they seemed to be everywhere. I decided to make the ruts my new goal because if I didn't master them, I knew that it would bite me. At this stage, I was not good at keeping the bike in a rut, even on a dry track, so I actually avoided them every chance I got. Well, when it gets muddy, you can no longer avoid the ruts. They're everywhere. Straightaways, corners, takeoffs, landings, you're gonna be in them. And if you try to get out or avoid them, you'll crash. And even worse, if you're in one and then try to get out of it, whether on purpose or not, you'll most likely cross rut and then possibly crash. One of the most obvious things that was easy to learn yet hard to implement on this day in particular was avoiding front tire focus. And you can actually tell in the video, which I think is really cool. When my eyes start looking right in front of my fender, the camera starts pointing down, giving away the fact that my focus is no longer further ahead like it should be. You can visibly see it in the footage. It's so fascinating because this is the hardest part about riding in the mud. It's hard not to fixate on the rut, but you can't focus on it. You have to look ahead and trust that your bike will follow the line. Again, easy to say, much harder to actually do. I had to force myself to do this repeatedly, and it was very difficult, though I did improve over time. Another thing I started to notice was that I was becoming extremely comfortable in the air. The reason for this was, anytime my bike was on the ground, I was having to work hard to keep it moving forward and under control. But anytime I hit a jump and the bike was airborne, it was a break from that added effort.
Jumping is the easy part. It really is.
Jumping really is the easiest part. Whenever you're in the air, there's almost nothing for you to do other than stay in position. Maybe shift if you need it, or brake tap, I suppose, but I was far from doing anything like that yet. This perspective shift really helped me with my mental approach to jumps, because when I first started, they were easily the most daunting and anxiety-inducing obstacles to approach. Yet nearly every crash or close call I've had has been in a corner, and very few have been on jumps. When presented in this way, it creates a much more comfortable and approachable view of jumps on a dirt bike. As long as I do my part on the takeoff and commit, there's really nothing else to do until I come back down, other than enjoy the ride. It's like anything, really. The first time is scary, and once you get the hang of it, the nerves go away and it becomes a little passé. Not to say it isn't still fun, but the adrenaline dump isn't scrambling your brain anymore at that point, and it becomes much, much easier. At one point, when I was quite frustrated, I found myself really stomping on the shifter way harder than I needed to, and I wound up tearing up my shifter really bad. I had to replace it after this trip because I stripped the OEM one really bad. I could have easily avoided this by downshifting in order to be in the proper gear prior to the points where I had to do it in a panic while the mud was grabbing and slowing me down. Be nicer to your shift lever than I was. I learned the hard way for sure. So in my last video, I intended to mention this, but I neglected to bring up the fact that the footage I'd taken proved to be extremely beneficial when it came to improving my technique off the track. Watching footage of myself was an absolute game changer. It allowed me to critique my technique from a fresh perspective, like a coach reviewing game tape. If you're serious about improving, film yourself. Hands down, it's the best way to fast track your progress. I'll explain. I believe it gave me the ability to repeat rides in my head without having to get on the bike, and it multiplied the number of laps logged in my brain. I think that fact alone really compounded my progression. This is the process I had been following, and I was beginning to feel good about how I was coming along. In this footage alone, it's easy to tell that when I start to become frustrated and tired, my technique just falls apart and the struggle ensues. An example of this is my elbows and hip posture. Keeping my elbows pointed up and out is something that I tend to remind myself frequently while I'm riding.
Elbows, elbows, elbows.
And it's easily verifiable by watching this footage back, as it's very obvious when I drop them. My hip posture is a little more tricky to pinpoint, as the only reference available from this angle is my shadow on the ground, and that's only possible when it's in the frame. But when you learn to look for it, it becomes obvious. It's embarrassing for me to relive, but helpful overall. I think I learned more during this one day than I ever have at a motocross track before, or any trail ride or day on the bike, period. Tricking my brain into conquering those those ruts was a really big victory for me. I was exhausted by the time I was done. But I actually got a chance to go riding again after this trip, and the improvements I saw riding in dry conditions after riding in the wet, muddy conditions like this were huge. And honestly, I think it's just because I had to work harder. In the past, I've ridden on trails that have had muddy spots. I've ridden through rivers where my butt got wet on the seat, but that's a fairly easy problem to deal with. Obviously, wet rocks are difficult, but I hadn't even ridden in the rain very much. It was definitely one of the most challenging things I've ever done. And I'm out here trying to have fun, right? In the next video, I'll be tackling another muddy track and putting these lessons to the test. So remember, if you're trying to improve, film your rides, hit the mud, and embrace the struggle. Trust me, it's worth it. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you at the finish line. Bye.